Communities are fragile. They do struggle, and they can break. I don't know. It seems like it would be case by case as to when they break, but they can get sick. I think that there's another way to think of it, that we get sick when we get stressed out, and it's chronic stress, and it's not as easy to fix. It doesn't mean taking Advil for a headache or taking antibiotics for bacterial infection, because it's not one consciousness that we're dealing with, right?
We talk a lot about individual stress, but what happens when stress becomes collective? When it settles into a culture, shapes identity, and changes what people believe is normal? After writing Military Culture Shift, I kept coming back to one question: can a community break? To explore that, I sat down with sociologist Dr. Seth Abrutyn. Dr. Seth Abrutyn is a full professor of sociology at the University of British Columbia and one of the most imaginative voices studying how communities shape mental health, belonging, and social pain. He's written widely on suicide, collective stress, and the emotional roots of human behavior. His most recent book is Life Under Pressure, a deep look into how a seemingly perfect community began experiencing reoccurring youth suicide clusters.
When I was an undergraduate many, many years ago, I was a psychology major, and I was taking two courses at the same time. For my minor in sociology, I was taking a sociology of emotions course, and for my major in psychology, I was taking sort of a capstone course on behavioral psychology. And the differences in how emotions were being talked about in sociology being open to sort of the subjective internal processes of emotions as much as the observable things, really was just so different from sort of the psychological processes that we were talking about. And I fell in love with sociology and thinking about the collective, whether we're talking about small groups or communities or even societies, as opposed to just focusing specifically on individuals. And I kind of ran with it. And over time, I studied a lot of different things as a grad student, as most grad students do. But in my first job, a colleague that was hired at the same time as me, Dr. Anna Muller, who's at Indiana University, we both sort of shared a lot of things in common and spent a lot of times with ourselves and our partners hanging out and drinking wine. And, we decided that we would, to help each other out, take a stab at studying something very classic to sociology, which happened to be suicide. And that dates back to one of the earliest books written by a sociologist, a French sociologist, Émile Durkheim, who chose suicide to show that sociology could explain what is often thought of as a highly individual, psychological phenomenon. And his findings, some of his findings have held up quite nicely. And Anna and I decided we would try and push it a little bit further. And we started looking at suicide contagion, or the spread of suicide from when one person is exposed to a family member or friend's suicidality. We wrote a few papers using statistical data. We kind of just ran out of data, like what we wanted to know. And so we started asking real people who had lost a friend or a family member to discuss their experience and to try and get at why some people were more vulnerable to suicide after losing somebody versus being protected against it or sort of being able to grieve and survive it. That just happened to lead us to a community that had been having a recurring youth suicide problem for almost 15 years, and dating back even further, where they had had at least 4 clusters that we were able to identify. And a cluster is when 2 or more people die by suicide within a very small period of time in one physical location, beyond what we would expect would happen. And, they were having basically one suicide almost every year of youth, which was far beyond what we would expect in a particular high school. And so my colleague and I just started working intensely on that particular place and talking to parents and talking to community leaders and talking to mental health professionals, talking to youth, and trying to get at that puzzle, which culminated in a recent book I'll shamelessly self-promote that came out last year called Life Under Pressure. And so I've been interested in this sort of process of how communities kind of, or groups or whatever collective we're interested in, how they kind of hold people together and protect them against not necessarily suicide only, but, mental health is challenges, substance abuse challenges, and how they can make people's lives happier and healthier. And, I'm interested in a lot of things. It's just suicide happened to be the phenomenon that I got really, really like focused on heavily.
Seth's work starts with a simple but radical idea. Sometimes what looks like an individual crisis is actually a collective one.
We were in a relatively affluent, tight-knit suburban community that when I think, people think of like the American sort of idyllic small town, this was the place. Like it was safe. The kids we spoke with talked about how they knew all the adults on their block and everyone could go to it. There wasn't, any crime. There was very few rental units, if any. There was very few kids that were, getting free lunches. It was basically a great place. And it raised a really big question, sociologically interesting question, like why in a place that is seemingly perfect, that every parent would want to raise their kid in and has the resources, the financial resources to throw at any problem that they might have, why is there suicides happening on a regular basis here annually, and why are there clusters? And as we dug into it, we came to see that this sort of connectivity is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it produces the potential for support and warmth and purpose. But on the other hand, right, it reduces the amount of privacy that people had, especially kids. And so the structure itself is not necessarily the problem, right? It's the culture that becomes complicated. And the culture there happened to be one of perfectionism. And this meant, in the positive sense, or what you're supposed to do, is that you're supposed to achieve academically, athletically, and socially and be great at it. And when I was growing up in high school, you were expected to do those things too. But the athletes were the athletes, and like the kids who were really good at school were the kids that good at school, and the journalism kids were the journalism kids, and the art kids. But in this place, and I think in this time, for most kids that are trying to go to universities in the U.S., they have to do everything. And so these kids were under a tremendous amount of pressure to achieve and to look like it was easy to achieve, right? So they were not only just having to do well, but they had to be like not tired and, able to be the lead actress in the play and like the captain of the best sports team. So they were under this pressure, and then they were under a second set of pressure because there's a high degree of mental health stigma that used to be in this community. And so predictably, they weren't sleeping a lot, which is a very serious risk factor of mental health challenges as well as suicidality. They were stressed out all the time from all this pressure. And then they had all the other usual things, like the girls in the community had, image conscious issues, which led to eating disorders among some of them, the usual depression that you would expect for kids that aren't getting enough sleep and not doing as well as they want to do or thinking they're not doing as well. And they weren't getting any help. That is, they couldn't seek help because of how little privacy that they had. So their parents, we talked to mental health professionals about this, their parents would come and their kid would be in a crisis and they would say something to the effect, can we fix this quietly and easily? And as you know, as a clinician, nothing is easy to fix. Like it takes therapy and it takes time and it takes a commitment among all the family members in the support system to like be trying to make changes and trying to like be there. And so the kids weren't getting help. They were under pressure. They felt like they were failing sort of at all, turns. And then you had the last ingredient in this community, which was they had a history of, visible suicides. And these suicides were not the people you would expect. They were like the really high achieving kids, which would then cause everybody to stop, scratch their heads and go, wow, that kid is accepted to 10 universities that are great. They would have a great SAT score. They're captain of multiple teams. They seem like they have everything going for them. What happened, right? And so this would then lead into the community. And it wasn't just an individual. It was the local newspaper, the regional newspaper, parents, religious leaders, everybody would be having these town halls and raising questions, and they started talking about it. And the conclusion they kept coming to was that it was pressure. These kids were under too much pressure. And, this kind of papered over the fact that as we learn more and more about these decedents, that they were suffering from mental health issues that, they could have been medicated for, or they could have gotten therapy for, and that might not have fixed it. But it was papering over some of the real stuff that was going on. And so soon kids just started to think, well, I'm under pressure. My friends are under pressure. These high achieving kids are under pressure. And if they could die, as one respondent told us, is if they could die, why can't I die by suicide? And so it became just a very normal option for these kids, and nobody really knew what to do, because the solutions that we often turn to are highly individualized ones, right? Like, so therapy is helpful, but you're looking at a culture that really needed to sort of rethink what it was doing.
What struck me most was that nothing about this community looked like the stereotype we often attach to crisis. It was safe, resourced, connected. And yet Seth describes that same connectivity as a double-edged sword. In a place where everyone knows everyone, privacy disappears. And when the culture prizes perfection, academically, socially, athletically, the pressure becomes constant and invisible. Add stigma around mental health, and struggle has nowhere to go. That's when the pressure stops being an experience and becomes the air everyone breathes. I'm Corey Weathers, and this is Restored: Stories of Conflict, Healing, and Peace. So I would love to ask you more about this article, which I think the first question is, and for those that have not read the article, which I will put the article and all of your work, your website, more about you in the show notes. The article itself was really talking about collective stress, communities who go through cultural trauma. And this is my crude summary of it, but just really talking about what happens to a community when they've been through that collective trauma. And again, I found it because I was really trying to answer the question of, can a community break? Like, after so much pressure and compounding stress, can there be a breaking point to a community after there's been prolonged stress? And so while you didn't directly answer that question, there was so much more that you talked about in that article. So I'd love to ask you first, where did this idea come from to write this article? Like, where did that passion, because clearly a lot of work went into this, because it's a professional journal. So where did that come from?
Sure. Well, so I stumbled upon, as I was moving out of suicide only and into sort of this thinking about separation and rejection. I mean, that's kind of like one of the core things that adolescents feel that often gets them close to suicidality. I found this whole body of literature on the brain that evidently humans at some point in their evolution there's two circuits in our brain for physical pain. So there's like the actual sensation. So if somebody pinches you or you get stabbed, like you feel this physical pain that your nerve endings react. But then there's an affective or an emotional response of that, like that hurts a lot. And the two are separate. Like they overlap, the circuits and the physiology overlap a little bit, but they're separate. And evidently we evolved to activate the emotion one when we feel rejected or isolated or separated or excluded, which is, it's still intuitive, right? We talk about heartbreak, or, we feel the sting of being kicked out of our friend group when we're on the playground. And, all these feelings that we get, it's actual pain. And so I was reading about this, and at the same time, I was reading a lot about disasters, both natural disasters like tornadoes or earthquakes that, level a part of a community or sometimes in its entirety, as well as human-made disasters like this very famous sociological case of this West Virginian hollow that had 5 communities that were all coal mining communities. And the coal mining company did not take the proper safety protocols. And at some point, there was this massive coal water flood, and it was devastating. It was tearing bridges and uprooting houses, and it killed lots and lots of people. And it basically destroyed these 5 different communities. And the sociologist was invited in there from the insurance company representing the community members. And as he's collecting this data for the insurance company and for the court cases, he starts seeing that that sense of social pain was collectivized, that it was being shared by all of the people, and they were experiencing symptoms. They had phantom limb, pain. They had a lack of direction, they didn't know which way they were moving, and they didn't have a sense of reference point. They felt, a sense that there was impending doom and disaster at any moment, and so there was this mixture of this sort of PTSD that we would expect, and this other piece of social pain, but it was happening to everybody. And what was really interesting was people that were fortunately not there when the flood happened, but there were members of the community. When they came back, they all started vicariously catching, quote unquote, catching these symptoms. And, he called this collective trauma. And I really saw this and I was like, well, really, it's collective trauma, but what makes it powerful is it's like a shared sense of separation from the community itself. And, he uses, Kai Erikson used words like connective tissue to refer to the roads and the schools and the post office and the grocery store, all of these sort of social infrastructure that have practical functions of getting us from here to there or mailing a letter, but facilitated everyday interactions with people, everyday responses. And what happened, people suddenly lost their North Star. They lost their roadmaps because they didn't exist anymore. And they were suddenly, living next to all these people in, mobile homes, waiting for, it wasn't FEMA at the time, it was, the equivalent of FEMA to figure out what to do with these devastated places. And, people didn't just get over it. They felt true pain, right? They were, as you were talking about, they were broken. And, we see in a community that, say, has a tornado, destroy a part of it, when they rebuild, right, there's this sort of reinvigoration, this sort of renewal of community. But, it's in the lingering question of what happens when renewal is either slowed down or impossible, right? It means that pain lingers on for longer and longer. So that's why I started writing this paper and I started investigating more and more cases. I started thinking about the cultural side of this, the intergenerational passing of social pain from Black Americans or for Jews who had survived the Holocaust and their great grandkids, or obviously indigenous communities and all throughout the world. And any community that had been hit can pass this down, right? I don't know if anyone's ever followed up with these West Virginians, but it would be a fascinating thing to talk to their grandchildren, because this was 1972, I think. So, their parents would be, like my grandparents or my, late end of my parents. And so those kids and their grandkids are living, right? How do they feel? How is this passed down?
Well, you also bring up what I thought was interesting. You use Ferguson as an example, that even if somebody wasn't similar to the Virginians, where if they weren't there when it happened, it still impacted them. You liken that to Ferguson, where Black Americans were deeply impacted by this event. Maybe it was because of the use of technology and seeing and witnessing and watching it play out and feeling deeply affected by it, but that this spread across the country. So it's maybe less critical that you are there in that specific moment when it happened, but that culturally this can impact large groups of people.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so if you think of the collective trauma being the direct event itself, that cultural trauma piece is the piece where people can, obviously they can pass it down intergenerationally. Anybody who shares a collective identity and a social identity. So you can be far flung and you say, I'm an American but I live in Germany and something happens to the US. You can experience that through television, through social media, through emails, through conversations with people directly on the ground, through images. And, I think the longer the longer the period of that sort of trauma being a part of the identity, the more likely, right, the more hyper vigilant we are. So Black Americans, right, seeing one, Black man after another being pulled from a car, being shot in a car, or being beat up, like, yeah, maybe you've lived your whole life not having experienced any of that, but that's part of the narrative, right? That's part of both the American historical narrative, but it's also part of that identity. Just as Jews often react real quickly when there are, I think there's both the victim part of it, but there's also like when real serious stuff happens, like they maybe have never experienced anti-Semitism. They may not even go to synagogue. They may not identify strongly as a religious Jew, but they absolutely feel bits and pieces of that, depending on how much of that narrative they've learned about and internalized.
In my quest to answer this question of whether or not communities could actually break or reach a breaking point, I didn't realize that I needed a new language that Seth was now helping me figure out. When communities go through prolonged stress, the damage isn't only psychological, it's relational. We lose trust. We lose shared reference points. We lose the small daily interactions that remind us we belong to something bigger than ourselves. He calls those everyday anchors the connective tissue of community. Schools, parks, routines, third spaces, and the simple ways we stay human together.
To return to Poplar Grove, like one of the things that we found with the youth there, because of the fact that there had been these recurring suicides, was there was the belief that suicide could happen to anybody. And I mean, statistically, that is not true. And also, research shows that that's not true. And people don't really just randomly, impulsively just die by suicide. There's usually quite a bit of premeditation behind it. And so you develop this sort of belief in the normativity of it, right? And so I think to go back to the school violence one, I think a lot of youth in the United States, they just like all of us, we can put a lot of that stuff out of our minds on a day-to-day basis when we're not like having to deal with high stress situations. But there is this sense that it could happen, and that it could happen at my school at any point. And there is no reason to believe that it can't happen at any point to a school. And so there is this sort of like low level stress, which I think, research shows that chronic stress has physical effects on people. As you age, it has physical effects on cardiovascular issues. It ages you biologically. It weakens your immune system. And so, I think these kids are just living with this sort of low level stress. But then the other thing, when we think about it culturally, like the question of like value of a community. So if you're a high school kid and you do these lockdown drills, and then you see there's another shooting, and then there's another shooting and another shooting, to the point where it's almost like they don't even report the number of shootings anymore, you start to ask questions of like, well, how valuable am I? Right? Like, if I'm not valuable enough to protect, right? If I'm a person who is potentially a victim at any point, well, what does that mean for who I am and for my future and where I want to be? And I think that probably creates a lot of complex. I think people probably become it encourages self-interest. It encourages like individualism, right? You have to protect yourself if nobody else is going to protect you. And, it raises questions about like adult youth trust. Who do I trust? Like, who really has my best interests at heart? And so I think, and that can obviously be spread to any group, right? Any group that is under that kind of chronic stress can ask questions of like, well, what's my value? Like, am I a valuable member of this community? And if not, well, what am I supposed to give to the community if I can't expect much to be given back?
Can you say more on that?
Yeah, well, so like, I mean, we can use any hypothetical minority, right? I mean, if you belong to a group that is undervalued, whether it's because of your gender or your race or your religion or your sexuality or, your occupation or your age, then, and a community operates on the principles of cooperation to some degree and coordination, and that people give because they're getting some reciprocal benefits from it, right? So, I mean, there are basic benefits. Roads are paved. People obey stop signs most of the time. There's food, there's grocery stores, there's mail carriers, there's things like that. But then there's like, if I have to follow all of the rules in a community, the informal rules, the rules we don't, you know, police. Like what's the incentive to follow those rules if I'm considered undervalued? What's the sense of me, breaking, like giving more in situations when I don't know whether I'm going to get anything in return for it? And it's not like a cost benefit analysis. I mean, that's not how people operate. But I think people that are undervalued start to, operate on ways to get the rewards that all humans want, to like feel loved and appreciated. And they may not pursue them in the ways that make for a good, healthy community because they're trying to get those same things.
Would disillusionment be a good word for that?
Yeah, I mean, people definitely get disillusioned. They experience. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that people can do it, right? Some people feel like moral apathy. They're just like, why? Well, who cares, And that can turn to a whole lot of things, gambling or like video games, or I mean, there's all sorts of ways that people can find that sort of like reward and pleasure that they can't get from social interactions and public spaces and like their jobs and things like that. And so disillusionment, moral apathy, sociologists refer to a condition called anomie, which is sort of a lack of moral regulation. Like people don't know what the right thing to do is because there's so many different right things, so and it's not like there's ever really time when there's perfect consensus, but like I think everybody can remember being in adolescence. And when you're an adolescent, you live in an anomic state. You're halfway between your parents and your family and your peers, and they don't always gel. They often clash heads, and that's stressful for kids, right? But it's part of growing up. But imagine being an adult and living with a sense of anomie that you don't know what's the right thing to do because you can see three different public celebrity people acting in three very different ways to the same types of problems or the same types of pressures. And then people don't know what the right way is, right? And then it becomes tribal in the sense that they can choose, well, this is the right way and everybody else has got the wrong way. Or again, they can become disillusioned or apathetic or like turn inwards, so it's hard when people don't feel like there's a group doing group stuff.
When people feel undervalued or unseen, their relationship with the community changes. It becomes harder to believe the social contract is real, harder to believe that your effort actually matters. And when that happens, people cope in predictable ways. They numb out, they retreat into private worlds, they stop trusting institutions, or they cling to tribes that offer certainty. In other words, social pain doesn't just hurt, it can reshape what we believe is safe. I decided to ask Seth about the military community because while every community is different, military life shares certain features: high cohesion, high expectations, constant transition, and a cultural tendency towards perfectionism and privacy. Here's what Seth had to say about the military community. So there's so much of what you just talked about that I could say I see that in our community, being that small town in America, if you want to call it that, as just being 1% of the American population, and yet so scattered, so isolated, with so much pressure on them to perform and to deliver excellence regardless of the cost. That I kind of am standing back going, what does it look like for us to do some of the things that you just described, which is, I mean, dare I say the next generation says, go out and touch grass. Like, what does it mean to be around your community, to talk about mental health in a new way, just side by side within community, reducing that stigma further, but maybe even challenging some of the pressure and the expectations to perform. Still doesn't, I mean, we can still ask for and reach for excellence, but that we can change some of the pressure within. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I do think it makes sense. And so when I talk and then I think about these things, especially in that paper versus, the book, which is very has a lot of detail that's very specific to a one place with a certain problem, and certain characteristics. When you telescope outside of that community and think about the paper, like, so a lot of the sort of elements are generic, right? There's structural things where there's tight knitness, and you see this in indigenous communities, both in Canada and the United States, where they're relatively closed geographically. Histories of discrimination and prejudice like closes them also from the outside. There's a lot of social and cultural tightness. People share a lot of similar things, just like in the military, where people share a lot of similar experiences. And their families live near each other, and they have a lot of those things, right? What ends up happening is you get on the ground, and when you'd want to diagnose or like come up with interventions, that's when getting into the details really, really matters a lot. Because a school, right, will have certain functions that, say a military base or like a military neighborhood or community just is going to be different. Just as an indigenous community is going to have a lot of different qualities. And so what we would want to do would be to get on the ground, right, and actually listen to people. And I think the pressure thing is a very common thing. And I think that I agree wholeheartedly that we are not trying to like water down excellence. Like, because lots and lots of kids from Poplar Grove and lots of places like Poplar Grove go off to college and do just fine. They don't enjoy their high school life, but they survive and they're resilient and they do just fine. And so suicide is still a relatively rare thing. But if we want to improve the happiness and the health and well-being of the kids in the community, then like thinking about ways to not intensify the pressure. So, parents, for instance, bragging about where their kid got into schools and like that being like the conversation piece versus finding other things to talk about, and I know that's a very natural thing to do, but being a little bit more deliberate and intentional about like what it is that really matters in our conversations and what it really matters in our presentation of self or our presentation of our family, that would go a long way, right? Because that's just another piece that kids in this community, for instance, have to worry about, is that like in the football stands during the game, this mom or that mom are like bragging about their kids. And then, the other parents feel like they're failing and are put, unintentionally and, sometimes unconsciously putting pressure on their kids or just feeling their own shame about like, why is my kid only in one of the 3 schools that they applied to or whatever is the case? It's like resetting our like what is normal, right? And the expectations of what is normal.
How did this impact all this studying and finding some of those conclusions? How has that impacted you as a parent?
Well, I mean, it's hard, right? We live in a really complicated world, one that is so different from when I was a child and a teenager. And so, I try to think about certain things and try to put certain practical things in place. And my children are young. They're 9 and 6. So some of the bigger problems haven't really reared their head. But the school that our kids go to, we have a pretty strong, it's not huge. And so there's a good community of adults, I think, generally speaking, who have committed to doing certain things. For instance, social media use is curtailed. It's just not something that we do. And, the recommendations by many psychologists right now is 16 is when you'd start it. I understand the pressure that kids are under to like be a part of their group and not be left out. And I don't know the easy solution to that. Like Australia, for instance, just banned it. And that might be one solution. But then there are like the other practical thing that we do is we have really cut down on the use of just screens in general. So my children don't have tablets. They don't use phones. They don't watch TV during the week, except under special conditions. They get as much TV, except we do stuff on the weekends. They get plenty of screen time on the weekends, or when they go over to a friend's house, like, for dinner or something. If the kids are playing video games, they play video games. But we cut that down and we sort of channel them towards either, if it's, it's Vancouver, so it rains, but we push them outside as much as possible. And then we do other things like art and try to just encourage a well-roundedness so that when they get bored, they have other sort of things. And then the other thing we do is we try, and this is a concerted effort that I think had been pretty intentional. Most of the parents in our neighborhood have landlines. And our kids now call each other on landlines. And so they set up play dates and they meet at and, I'm privileged in the sense that I can walk to my school. It's only like 5 or 6 blocks and there's a park there and it's very safe. And so like, we're just trying to get them outside and get them social and get them socialized so that it doesn't feel weird to call somebody and say, hi, this is, so-and-so is that person available, just so like they could talk to adults on the phone like we used to do. And so for now it's working, right? I mean, I haven't hit the adolescent phase when obviously things change in really important ways. And they haven't gotten to the high schools yet where I imagine things are different. But, it's between that and like being able to talk about mental health, in an age appropriate way. But one of the things you learn when you study suicide is that talking about suicide, kind of like talking about sex or drugs with kids, doesn't make them do those things. It actually reduces the likelihood and it creates that trust that if they are struggling at any time, they know that they can come to somebody and that person might not have all the answers, but they will be able to like help in an adult way.
I think it's great that you put that distinction out there, because I guess somebody could have heard that first part of what you said and think of it as contagious and we shouldn't talk about it, when you're actually saying, no, it's how we talk about it. And are we talking about it? And are we talking about all the different modes of support, resources of support that people have? I'm really enjoying watching the millennial generation surge forward with this social contract to do something different with their kids. It's been really fascinating to watch. In fact, when I have studied these different generations, at first Gen Alpha was coming on the scene. This would be, your kids, Gen Alpha. And there was a lot of like, people predicting what we thought Gen Alpha was going to look like. And at first everybody was making these assumptions that they were going to be the most digitally connected generation to date. And that's, for some reason, they drew connections that they would therefore also be the wealthiest generation to date. So there's all these kind of interesting predictions. And then all of a sudden, the millennial parents, I think there's a lot of people that are starting this movement. I also saw what was coming out of Australia. There's some from Jonathan Haidt and his social contracts of screen-free schools and all that. And so I started seeing more and more millennial parents doing exactly what you're describing, you're doing, and your community is doing. And with that social contract, you do have, it's easier for, if we have a landline, someone else has a landline. It normalizes what's happening in your home and the rules that are happening in your home, because it's the same kind of values that are happening in the home down the street or with the friends at school. And it's been interesting because I think it's shifting Gen Alpha in the most beautiful way. And I think it reminds us that, we can change certain systems. We can change things in our culture if there's a collective social contract to do so. And usually, thankfully, it's the parents who care about their kids that seem to be the easiest social contracts to make, is to change our parenting style. So I'm not sure. It sounds like you're seeing that up there as well in Vancouver.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's hard, right? We all sort of had no choice in what happened. It was, I'm old enough to remember no internet, and then the internet appeared, and it was dial up, and it was chat rooms, and it was, really not ubiquitous because it was expensive. It's slow. And, there were a series of things that have happened really just over 10 years. And it feels like forever now, I think, but it's really only been 10 years where Twitter and Snapchat and, now TikTok are sort of these ubiquitous things. And, I don't take Jonathan Haidt's argument to its fullest and blame social media and phones for like why kids are so anxious and sad right now. I mean, it's definitely a piece of this puzzle, but there's sort of been these other indirect consequences of it, like the disappearance of public spaces. When I was a kid, there was nothing to do. So you went to the mall and you walked around for an hour and a half. Sometimes you bought something, sometimes you didn't. And, maybe that's lame, I guess, but it meant you were out doing something, and I think about movie theaters. I take my kids a lot to the theaters and I bring their friends with them. And I'm trying to cultivate the idea that, yeah, it's nice when it's raining out and it's dark, like we can stream movies, but there's something about being in a theater and listening to people laugh together, even though it's a pain in the butt and people are not always great in public, like it's still better to sometimes be around people than to not, and again, some of the problems is that these places have disappeared or they're harder to find. And that's my college students complain about. They're like, I would love to meet people in public, but where? And, because the mall is gone. There is no mall. I mean, there are malls here, but people go there specifically to shop. They don't have arcades anymore. They don't have, they're really just clothing malls for clothes, and there's a food court, but it's not the same type of food court when people aren't flooding into the mall.
Not to mention even coffee houses that I think were designed to maybe be a third place is a place where everybody put their earphones in and work. And it's, taking up a whole table, when it's just them instead of it being a collective space. So I think you're bringing up a really important point. Is it true that if individuals are resilient, that therefore communities are resilient and that they will bounce back regardless of how much stress they go through? Or can a community actually fracture? Can a community fall apart? And what have you seen as evidence of that? Or maybe we are resilient. Maybe both is true.
Yes, a community can absolutely fall apart. I mean, humans can die. They can go mad. They can suffer some suicide. Yep, they can lose their marbles, right? They can really not just like having a mental health issue, but like really have a psychotic break. I mean, we are fragile. We only can take so much, and I say that with true respect for the fact that humans are generally resilient. We've made it this long under far worse conditions in certain times and places, and part of it's because humans can hope. I mean, ultimately, hope is an irrational emotion that humans feel that allows them to weather a lot of storms and then find ways to pick it up. But communities are not that different from humans. I mean, groups disappear all the time. Like there are cliques in high schools that have really good friends, and then those people graduate and they go off to college, and then they get families and they move all over the country or all over the world. And maybe they talk through Facebook, and you could maybe call that a group, but it's not really a group because people don't redo group. They don't come together on a regular basis or some annual basis to do. Yeah, exactly. And so groups are fragile. And the bigger the group gets, so from a small group to an organization to a community to a society, it's kind of like a ship. The bigger a ship gets, the more it can weather. But the more tragic it is when it, has a massive break, right? So like a little rowboat will lose its two, people inside of it under a massive storm, but like a big cruise ship will go right through the storm. But obviously, if there was a tragedy on the cruise ship, it would have massive consequences for a lot of people's lives and their families. So communities are fragile. They do struggle, and they can break. I don't know. It seems like it would be case by case as to when they break, but they can get sick. I think that there's another way to think of it that we get sick when we get stressed out, and it's chronic stress, and it's not as easy to fix. It doesn't mean taking Advil for a headache or taking antibiotics for bacterial infection, because it's not one consciousness that we're dealing with, right? And so to answer the sort of sub question or the sort of tacit question of like, what can we do? Some of the things that I was pointing out about what I do with my own children are things that, they're practical steps that people can take. They're not easy, but nothing is easy. But finding ways to create public space that is free from this sort of like disease that has gripped everybody it's mostly in the US, but it is all over like the West, it is here in Canada too, but the polarized like disease that has gripped so many people and reclaiming space. And, one of the ways to do it, you made a point about comparing, say, the military community to these other places, and that there's clear comparison. And then you did that thing that a lot of people do when they're talking about their own group, is that it's not as bad as what minorities have or what everybody else has. And I think, there's something good to say or it's good to say, to recognize that certain groups have had certain really horrific things that have happened to them that are different qualitatively from some of the things that another group is happening. But it's also really important for people to have the empathy. And this is not something that comes natural to sociologists, which you would think it would, but it's important to have empathy, to think about that all the stress or illness or community trauma, social trauma that group A is experiencing and group B is experiencing may be different for different reasons. And there might be bigger inequities in outcomes in some ways, but the sooner people can recognize that they're both suffering, the sooner people can actually build what we're talking about, which is a better community. And that's really hard to do. I mean, sociologists, for instance, have a super blind spot. Like, they are generally, not always, but generally, like, opposed to the wealthy and like the capitalist class. And there's reasons for this empirically and historically, but and so as a result, they don't usually study those individuals, right? They make a lot of assumptions about them. But when I study privileged kids, and the kids are really, they don't choose, just like a poor child does not choose to be born in a poor family, or a military kid doesn't choose to be born in a military family. They are the innocent, like, they're just random. It's randomness. They are born wherever they're born. And then when you start to talk about them and you understand that their pressures are real, I mean, we can critique who has the pressures more, I suppose, but their pressures are just as bad as a kid who's moved multiple times and is living in another high school on another military, you know what I mean? And it's so, the sooner people start to realize that we're either all in this together, or we truly are in these warring tribal camps that have emerged. And I don't know, I'm not a golden ageist, so I'm not going to say it was ever beautiful or perfect and like idyllic, but it certainly has been better, and it certainly can be better.
I think I spent so much time looking for the breaking point that what I hear you saying is there's value in not waiting for us to get to that point, that there is value in saying, let's not look for like where things actually fall apart. How about we value when there's illness and when there's sickness in the community, and that needs to be lifted up as important enough that we're willing to do something individually, collectively. And like we said at the beginning of this conversation, even better when you have a social contract to do it together. And so I hear that as a wonderful reframing for me, that I think that I have, in the struggle to shift the system, or in my own advocacy, in the lack of trying to get people to care also about the illness, I think I glossed over it too and said, well, where are we headed? And instead, I think coming back to that of just going, it's okay to also talk about we're not well, and let's talk about what's not making us well. And is it possible for us to do a few things that might make us better?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's great. And I think that's I mean, like you can't ignore thinking about the future and using the future as a tool of maybe motivating some people. But I think we get sick and we get stronger when we recover from our sickness, right? I mean, the old saying of whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I think that in a lot of ways we've lost that. And I don't know why, like I see, I don't want to be the old man, like yelling at youth, because I don't think it's really that way. But I do see there's a sense of we can't be resilient anymore. And I think that is just a symptom of the community can't be or can't be resilient. And it can be. I know, it takes reprioritizing things, and it takes, I think, healing some of the pain that has been experienced in the last like 10 to 15 years. But I like to think that humans have continued to survive, and I don't see why they would stop, and sometimes just thinking about how do we like take care of each other now? How do we meet each other, right? Halfway, take care of each other now. Some of it's practical, right? Some of it's just like, we need more medical care and less cost for it. And not just medical care, we need to prioritize mental health. And that's something Canada doesn't do very well, is it's just like everywhere else. It's expensive and there aren't enough providers, but well, how do we solve that problem? And if we can't solve it completely, how do we make it better?
I appreciate that Seth's answer invites us into the messiness where there isn't a perfect equation. It's an invitation, instead, back into responsibility, small, practical choices that rebuild belonging over time. Notice who's unseen. Create systems where people are noticed early, before a crisis. Reclaim spaces where we can be together without performing. And maybe most importantly, recover empathy across differences. And maybe most importantly, recover empathy across difference. Because the moment we stop seeing each other's pain as real, community will become impossible. We can't solve collective stress with purely individual solutions. But we also don't have to wait until community breaks to take its illness seriously. Healing begins when we admit we are not well, and when we decide to rebuild the connective tissue that keeps humans human. Belonging, responsibility, shared spaces, and the courage to care for one another again. Peace isn't the absence of pressure. It's the presence of people willing to carry the work of repair together. If this episode resonates, I'd love to hear your story. Record a voice memo and email it to restored@CoreyWeathers.com. I'm Corey Weathers, and this is Restored.